The Swanson Lecture Fund at the Cranbrook Academy of Art was established in 1983 by the family of J. Robert F. Swanson, a noted architect who was also the son-in-law of Elio Saarinen. Each year, the Swanson Lecture Fund supports lectures by architects, designers, artists, or scholars who have achieved critical acclaim for their work and have a sustained record of excellence and achievement in their respective field. The Swanson family has quite a distinguished history at Cranbrook, and I am honored to recognize two members who made this important lecture series possible. Architect Robert Swanson is a life governor of the Cranbrook Academy of Art, and he is the architect of the DeSalle Auditorium, where we would be seated for this lecture under normal circumstances. Bob's daughter, Karen, Elio Saarinen's great-granddaughter, is also an architect in the area and is a current governor on the Academy's Board of Governors. We are truly grateful to the Swanson family for their generosity over the years and for helping us to preserve the legacy of J. Robert F. Swanson and enhance the future through lectures like the one we are about to experience this evening. Thank you, Bob and Karen. Now, I would like to welcome the Academy's architect in residence, Dr. Gretchen Wilkins, to introduce tonight's Swanson guest lecturer, Princeton University professor, Dr. Beatriz Colomina. Gretchen, I turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Susan. I'm Gretchen. I'm the head of the architecture department here at Cranbrook Academy of Art. It's such a pleasure to welcome Beatriz Colomina for our first Swanson lecture. Our second Swanson lecture, we'll have two this year, will be Mabel O. Wilson. That will be in the beginning of next year, so we'll let you know about that. I just first of all want to echo Susan's gratitude for the Swanson's support of this lecture series that we have every year. It's so important to the department. We're able to bring in stellar speakers like tonight to the department, so thank you again for that. Beatriz Colomina is an internationally renowned architectural historian and theorist who has written extensively on questions of architecture, art, technology, sexuality, and media. She's founding director of the Interdisciplinary Media and Modernity program at Princeton University and professor and director of the graduate studies in the School of Architecture there. Her work has been published in more than 25 languages, and her books include X-Ray Architecture, Are We Human?, The Century of the Bed, Domesticity and War, Privacy and Publicity, Sexuality and Space, and many others, several of which have received prestigious international awards. Beatriz Colomina has lectured extensively at universities and art museums throughout the world and has curated a series of international exhibitions, installations, digital platforms, and new forms of publication. Her talk today, Architecture in the Age of Pandemics, from Tuberculosis to COVID-19, is fittingly brought to you safely and socially distanced via this webinar. I wish that was a design of one of Dr. Colomina's fantastic installations. Unfortunately, it's by necessity, but it's great because we're able to reach so many people. So thank you all for joining us. You can ask questions in the Q&A tab, type in your questions. I'll be monitoring that. We'll wait till the end of the lecture and then we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Colomina. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your invitation to be here with you tonight, and thank you so much to Gretchen Wilkins and to Susan Ewing for the wonderful introduction, and to, of course, to the Swanson family for their generosity. I'm super happy to be speaking in Cranbrook, even if I'm not really in Cranbrook, and unfortunately I've never been in Cranbrook, which is kind of painful because it's been so much part of my research on the IMSS, on Saarinen, etc., that in a way I see that it's part of my life, such a mythical place that I hope to visit on another occasion when all of this is has passed. This theme of today, I'm going to share the screen and see whether this works, and I hope it does. Let me see. Do you see the screen? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, great. So this question of the relationship between architecture and illness has been a very, very long preoccupation for me, probably my longest preoccupation. It goes back at least in terms of writing to the year that I actually arrived in New York, and I was a fellow at the New York Institute for the Humanities. This is 1980. And one of the senior fellows happened to be Susan Sontag, who had written that beautiful book, Illness as Metaphor. And of course, her book is not at all about architecture, but about literature. But nevertheless, through this reading, I became obsessed with how much of modern architecture had been indebted to pathologies. And I started to be obsessed with this connection between architecture and illness, whether they are real, like tuberculosis, or imagined, whether they are mental, like agoraphobia and claustrophobia, or nervous disorders of every kind. But particularly, I was obsessed with tuberculosis, hygiene, germs, fresh air, all these obsessions that, in a way, as you will see, gave birth to what we understand as modern architecture. And this is exactly the subject of my latest book, X-ray Architecture, which in a sense is my latest book, but also my earliest unwritten one, because I started writing this as my dissertation at the Institute precisely in those very early years when I was super young. And it never concluded in part because there was not a climate for the reception of such ideas. And the moment I left the Institute and I went to Columbia University and to Barcelona, where I had studied architecture, none of these people thought that this was an appropriate topic for a dissertation, believe it or not. I mean, they thought I should do something more architectural. So I ended up working on the Corbusier and laws, and I don't have any complaints. That became the book Privacy and Publicity, that has been very important to me. But in fact, this question became like a little bit of an obsession, and returning to it so late, so many years afterwards, has been a little bit like the return of the repressed. And let me show you a few images. This is Susan Sontag around those years, and some images from the book, just to give you a sense of the kinds of obsessions with health, with X-rays, with the treatment of tuberculosis, but also with more contemporary forms of surveillance, right, and of illnesses. In fact, my project, in a way, since the publication of X-ray, is a bit about health and architecture in the 21st century, which has been described by some critics as the age of the neurological disorders, environmental allergies, the microbiome, and of course the crisis of diversity and climate change. If the X-ray project then is about the intimate relationship between architecture and the health of the human, then the focus has now shifted to the health of the planet. And frankly, I thought that having written this book on X-ray architecture, I have finally exorcised, if you want, my demons, and that I liberated myself from this lifetime obsession with illnesses and architecture. But then, of course, coronavirus arrived, and I'm back into the group, almost as if I had brought this plague into myself. It is uncanny, in a way, to think about or to what extent the issues and the fears are so similar. And you can see, for example, these images of poignant images in our time, of something that happened around 1918. This is nurses in Boston during the flu epidemic of 1918. And think about these medical workers with these protective suits in Liberia, protecting themselves, of course, from Ebola. They are about to enter a space where patients with Ebola are secluded. Or think about these images, of more contemporary images of this person, for example, in the streets of some city. So in many ways, there is this resonance that I think I would like to bring a little bit more into the discussion today. Perhaps this is in a way the disease of the historian, that to think that the past is always offering urgent lessons for the future, and I think that that is the case. In any case, the point is that once again, historical research has been accelerated in a way by contemporary urgency, and in an uncanny echo of the 19th century epidemics, like tuberculosis, that revolutionized the design of interiors, of furniture, buildings, and cities. Without question, the coronavirus will also call design into action, and this is very important in a place like Cranbrook, or where I teach at Princeton in schools of architecture, because this is definitely going to affect us. We need to grasp the entangled, if you want, interrelationship between microorganisms and not only architecture and the city, but at this point even the planet. And one of the most surprising things during the research was to realize to what extent this preoccupation between architecture and illness was actually very, very old, right? And I was starting to think about writing this book about tuberculosis and the birth of modern architecture. And I realized that I wanted to go back and see a little bit when this obsession started. And it starts with the very beginning of architectural theory. So you have that classical theories of the Greek polis already follow the theories of the four humors, and here you have Vitruvius in the first century BC, that of course is launching Western architectural theory as we know it, by insisting precisely that all architects should also study medicine. So just think about it, in case you didn't have enough with architecture, now you have to study medicine as well. Why? Because health is your main objective, right? And he devotes a lot of these first books of the first book of his 10 books on architecture to this question of health, giving very detailed instructions on how to determine the health of a city or the healthiness of a site by sacrificing an animal and inspecting the liver and see whether the liver is sound and firm. And if it's sound and firm, you can have a city there. But it's also very interesting when he discussed the health of a site for a particular building, right? And emphasizing again the theories of the four humors and the fluids in the human body and the direction of the winds, etc., etc. But the most interesting point for me is when he reverses it and he says that those who are unwell can also be cured by architecture. They can be cured through design, rebuilding the system, he says, of those exhausted by disease, including, he says, consumption. And consumption, of course, is an old word for tuberculosis. So here you have that at the very beginning of architectural theory with Vitruvius, there is already this idea that architecture can not only prevent, but even cure tuberculosis. And I think this was a very important moment for me to discover that this had a long, long history. And then, of course, I went through a quick history of architecture to see that there is this constant connection. So when you get to the Renaissance, the central reference for architecture, despite all these bodies that you know, including Leonardo or this one of Cesare Cesarini, is not a whole body as they make you believe, but it's a dissected, fragmented, and analyzed body. And I want to demonstrate this to you by telling you the story that in Renaissance, the first schools of architecture, the first schools of design in the Renaissance was the Accademia del Disegno in Florence in 1563, where they decided to place themselves next to the medical school. And even more amazing, all students of design or students of architecture were required to attend dissection in the local hospital in the same way that medical students were obligated to attend dissection, except that the students of design were obligated also to draw this body that decomposed, even if they were reports that people were getting sick, that the students were vomiting, and nevertheless they have to be there for days on end designing this body. As doctors investigated the mysterious interior of the body through cutting it and dissecting it. It's of course a new technique. All of a sudden, architects decide also that to understand the interior of buildings, they also have to cut through section cuts, etc. So in the sketchbooks, for example, of Leonardo da Vinci, which you know so well, cutaways views of architectural interiors appear sometimes even besides anatomical drawings. He understands, as you can see here, the interior of the brain and of the womb in architectural terms, as enclosures that need to be cut to understand or to reveal, if you want, their secrets. But to make the story very short, if you, and then here's another example of this combination of architecture and dissection and bodies, but let's just move quickly to the 19th century, and you have people like Viollet-le-Duc, which in his famous Dictionnaire raisonné, he illustrates it with these perspectival cutaway drawings showing medieval buildings, he says, as if dissected, and he uses this precisely, this word of dissection precisely. He's been very influenced by this fellow, Marc Cuvier, who had written this book on the lessons of compared anatomy. And he treated, Viollet-le-Duc treated medieval architecture. He says one has to treat it as a body that needs to be analyzed. An animate being requires a dissection to allow the separate study of the parts, right? And so here you have some of these drawings. But again, to make the story short, as medical representations changed, so did architectural representations. And in the 20th century, it was precisely the widespread use of the X-rays that made a new way of thinking about architecture possible. Modern buildings even started to look like X-rays with transparent glass walls revealing the inner secrets of the structure. Right? On the left, you have this kind of portrait that became very fashionable at the time. People wanted to have their X-rays of their hands, and on the right you have, of course, Mies van der Rohe glass skyscraper of 1922, and you can see that there is this effect, this X-ray effect in the rendering and the effect of the photographs of this glass model that means placed in a garden. But he worked very hard. He had multiple examples of these photographs, and precisely he chooses this one because he's fascinated with this effect. Indeed, you can say that the modern buildings are not just myths, as you will see, are very much affected by X-rays. They were obsessed with X-rays. Mies collected X-rays. I mean, he published X-rays in case we had any doubt about his interest in X-rays. Indeed, you can say that the architecture of the early 20th century cannot be understood without grasping its relationship with disease, and especially with tuberculosis. A year before the German microbiologist Robert Koch discovered the tuberculosis bacillus, a standard medical book on the disease was given as causes: lack of exercise, sedentary indoor life, defective ventilation, and deficiency of lights. And of course, these are all environmental causes, and modern architects offer precisely health by providing such a change in environment. And all of a sudden, 19th century architecture was demonized as unhealthy. Like, for example, look at this poster of the Weissenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart, and behind this red cross, this thing that we now have to get rid of is this 19th century interior where dust accumulates, and instead we offer sun, light, ventilation, exercise, roof terraces, hygiene, and whiteness, very important, as a way to prevent, if not to cure, tuberculosis. And here you have other examples of the interest in exercise. So it's not just the buildings, but also the possibilities that these buildings provide of a more active exercise body as a way to prevent the disease. In fact, one could write an entire book. I didn't do this, but I went quite a bit through the history of tuberculosis sanatoriums, because in fact it's a very, very significant part of the history. Think, for example, about the active collaborations between architects and doctors at the turn of the century, something that we don't do so much anymore. This is Alvar and Aino Alto Paimio sanatorium in Finland in 1929, with dramatic terraces up in the sky. The Paimio sanatorium even has some kind of a resemblance, I think, in these canonic photographs to ribs in an X-ray. They have these very, very clean bedrooms, very much like a modern bedroom in a normal house will become available to everyone. You can see these clean line bedrooms, completely devoid of ornament, that were all designed according to the architects to minimize surfaces where dust could accumulate. Dust was the main obsession of that time. The idea that the bacillus hide it in the dust, and they were not wrong. I mean, it was true that the dust was a problem, right? And everything is designed, even the intersection, as you can see, of the floor and the wall is curved, so that under the window, so to avoid the accumulation of that dust under this this table and under this heating system. The rooms were totally equipped with furniture and sanitary fittings that were all designed by the architects, including chairs whose backs were angled to facilitate breathing and expectoration. They say the sinks that are designed to reduce splashing, and espitons to minimize sound. The door handles were also very carefully designed not to catch the sleeves of the doctors' white coats, but the building's main equipment was this top floor terrace, 7 stories above the landscape, where patients were wheeled out for regular doses of fresh air and sun in these lounge chairs, beautifully designed by Aino Alto, whom you can see now lying on the chairs in the terrace. So it's also a very astonishing image. It's no longer the heroic male architect in front of the building, but the fragile figure of modern architecture on the horizontal, lying on the chairs. So the figure of modern architecture is here an ill person. Tuberculosis made modern architecture modern. It's not that modern architects made modern sanatoriums. I would say almost that the opposite is the case, that the sanatoriums modernized the architects. Alto, for example, was a perfectly neoclassic architect before his so-called, in his words, conversion, as if it was some kind of religion, to functionalism. In 1927, when he entered this competition for a tuberculosis sanatorium in Kinkoma in Finland, which he didn't win, but in many ways anticipates Paimio. For Alto, he says the sanatorium was not architecture in the service of medicine, but integral to medicine. He describes architecture as an apparatus, device as a means of treatment. So architecture itself is the treatment. He says, he writes, the main purpose of the building is to function as a medical instrument. The room design is determined by the depleted strength of the patient reclining in the bed. And you can see this beautiful drawing, and we will go back to this question of the horizontal patient, because it's also very important to understand, and we often don't talk too much about biography, but I think it's very important, that Alto himself had been very sick at the time of the competition for the building, and claimed that having to lie in bed for an extended period of time had been crucial to his understanding of the problem. He says architecture is always conceived for the vertical person, and makes these beautiful drawings that you can see here. But here you have a client that is permanently on the horizontal, right? So the whole design of the room, of course, has to change. You cannot have live pictures on the ceiling irritating the eyes of the occupant in bed. He thinks about all kinds of things. He thinks about the view through the window to the porches also has to be calculated with this from the point of view of the bed. So in the terrace, for example, you have this very low, and also in the bedrooms, these very low parapets and thin rails that allow the eye of the horizontal patient to travel far away into the forest. The colors of the room also had to be thought in these terms. He talks about quiet, dark hues of blue for the ceilings. He talks about bright canary yellow in the reception rooms by the entrance, and in the linoleum in the lobby, in the staircases and the corridors, to evoke, he says, sunny optimism, even in cold, cloudy days. And you can believe in Finland it would be cold and cloudy quite a bit. Right? So he then goes on to say that psychological factors have also to be carefully considered. He says an extended period of confinement can be extremely depressing for a bedridden patient. So he says the hospital have to be thought as a new kind of house. I thought this is normal. Yeah, he wants to make the hospital kind of comfortable, right? Homely. But then the most interesting thing is when he turns it around and he says, in reverse, the generic house needs to be like a sanatorium. And I thought that's the most interesting point, right? He says, I was able to discover that special physical and psychological reactions by patients provide good pointers for ordinary housing. To examine how human beings react to forms and construction is useful to experiment, to use for experimentation, especially sensitive people such as patients in a sanatorium, right? So the bodily and psychological sensitivity of the sick person is used to recalibrate architecture. Even the specialized furniture became ordinary pieces. If the cantilever birch wood paimio chair, which you know very well, was designed to open the chest of the patient, allowing them to breathe easier, soon enough this chair became everybody's chair, as you can see in this advertisement. And you can still buy it today for like $2,000 or something. Likewise, with the rest of the furniture designed for Paimio, they wrote, the sanatorium needs furniture which will be light, flexible, easy to clean, again, and so on. And after a period of experimentation in wood, the flexible system was discovered to produce furniture, they say, which will be more suitable for the long and painful life in a sanatorium. Okay, so they established a workshop next to the sanatorium where they produce all this fantastic furniture, but only 2 years later, Aalto opened this furniture company called Artec, where the same furniture that had been designed for Paimio becomes everybody's furniture. This is not accident, because the reference point for Aalto was always the seriously ill. Aalto claimed that architects have to design for the person in the weakest position. Think about how this is in a way the road not taking, that always we have designed. Think about the modular of Le Corbusier, and we design for the really strong and healthy person. But he wants to design for the person in the weakest position. The tuberculosis patient becomes for him the model for architecture. In other words, sickness was no longer seen as the exception, but as the norm. And of course, varying degrees of sickness were seen to define the human condition. The modern subject suffers from many ailments, physical and psychological, and architecture is a protective cocoon, not just against the weather and other outside threats as we normally think about it, but in modernity, and this is something that escapes many times the discussion, is more notably against internal threats, psychological and bodily threats. Symptomatically, Aalto compared his experiments in Paimio and their application to everyday use to the exaggerated forms of analysis that scientists use in order to obtain more clear and visible results, she says, such as stained bacteria for microscope examination. So he saw design in a way as a form of medical research. This is very interesting passage, with the sanatorium acting as some kind of research lab for modern architecture, a way of testing architecture, looking at what has been hidden and exposing the invisible forces. Well, and with this, I'll move to the invisible clients of modern architecture. because if you think about it, Sigmund Freud, X-ray, bacteriology, and the germ theory of the disease were all born more or less around the same period of time, and they are all about looking inside, somehow acknowledging the invisible, the unconscious, the skeleton, the micro element of the bacteria, and the bacillus of tuberculosis. Architecture, likewise, turns itself inside out. The threat is no longer outside, but inside in the invisible. So you have the micro scale of the bacteria that becomes the basis of all this furniture, which you are very careful that no dust can accumulate there, rooms, houses, and cities. In that way, you can think about the micro and the micro, no? The city and the bacteria. And cities were suddenly seen as teeming with these unseen occupants that in a sense became the new clients of modern architecture and urbanism. So we are addressing ourselves so much to these bacteria as we are addressing to the inhabitants of architecture. The architect doctor becomes some kind of bacteriologist. For example, look at this passage of Le Corbusier, where he really describes architecture as bacterial. He says, we need a diagnosis and a line of contact. In 1922, I tried to delve into an analysis. I did some laboratory work isolating my microbe. I watched it develop. The biology of my microbe appeared in indisputable clarity. 32 square diagnosis. Then by an effort of synthesis, I drew up the fundamental principles of modern city planning. So as you can see here, microbes were both the literal and metaphorical basis of a new architecture and urbanism. Modern architecture paradoxically had to represent this new invisible order with bright, transparent images seen as clean, clear, and healthy in a kind of visual hygiene. Okay, let's see the next one. Why is it not moving now? Okay, so the history of modern architecture, as you know, is full of sanatoriums. This is Josef Hoffmann, Purkersdorf outside Vienna. There's also Otto Wagner's Steinhof in Vienna, the Queen Alexandra Sanatorium in Davos, 907, Jan Ducker and Visué Thonestral in Hilversum in the Netherlands, Richard Docker Sanatorium in Weiblingen, so many sanatoriums. This is William Gornster and William Pereira, Lake County Sanatorium, sanatoriums in Weiblingen. Many modern architects, as you can see, did a modern sanatorium at some point, and in some ways it defined them, right? The sanatorium became like the testing ground of new materials and techniques of construction, and very often, as I said before, involve experimental collaborations between avant-garde architects, engineers, and cutting-edge doctors. And I think this is very interesting how we lost this capacity to collaborate with other disciplines. We talk a lot about interdisciplinarity, but we don't really engage with in this way anymore. The sanatorium buildings were typically disconnected from cities, floating like ships on mountain sides and in forests, with their rows upon rows of sand terraces that are treated like little beaches, sometimes linked to artificial beaches on inside the building, like these kids here in some place in France, or these real beaches on the outside, like in this sanatorium. Where was it? In Kiev, I think. This sense of floating outside is normal urban habitat, and angling itself to the sun to heal these fragile bodies change or challenge the definition of architecture. 1 second. I think Mark. Sorry, my computer is about to get out of battery, and I'm not sure why this is happening. Sorry, there was a electricity problem, and I have to change the plug because I was losing. I don't even know how I realized that I was almost out of battery. Sorry for the interruption. So what was I talking about? About this architecture that is angling itself to the sun, like if it was itself taking the cure with this stacking all these terraces to a very steep angle with Marcel Breuer, for example, or this other project of Nicolai Visanti on the right in 1934 in the Italian Alps. But perhaps my favorite is this one, this strange and crazy collaboration between a radiologist, Jan Seidman, and an architect, a French architect, André Fardet, to make a 25 meters revolving sanatorium, 16 meters above the ground, that always face the sun for tuberculosis patients. This is in France, but they actually were quite successful, and they have some sort of a patent, and they went all over the world doing these revolving sanatoriums, including this one in Jamnagar, India. And they have this very sophisticated retractable glass panels and specialized focusing instruments to increase the exposure. And even the beds were kind of suspended in metal frames and able then to be rotated to a very steep angle and to be aligned again with the instrument. The sanatorium had from the very beginning been a laboratory for incubating new attitudes towards form. Think about, again, the Joseph Hoffmann Sanatorium Purkersdorf in Vienna, with its purified white surface and radically sharp lines and cubic furniture. Well, this is also Hennebic construction in reinforced concrete and iron. So it's the first use of this system of construction, and it happens to be in a sanatorium. Likewise, the use of electricity. So you have the cutting edge of technology and the cutting edge of architecture and the cutting edge of the curing of a disease coincided in the same place. Electricity was considered not only more hygienic, but also was used in all kinds of experimental therapies, including all these, looks like a machine of tortures, all these electric massage machines and electric bath and chairs for strengthening the nerves, etc. At the time the Purkersdorf was built, a critic, an architectural critic, Ludwig Hebesi, described it as the naked Hoffmann building, whose walls were lined with porcelain tiles. You can see in this picture, a white painted, a white tile washable wall. So you have very interesting ideas about how this could be clean. It resonates very much with the kind of things we are hearing today. Hebesi was so enthusiastic that he kind of checked himself into the sanatorium and tried all these therapeutic devices in the so-called mechanotherapy room. And he's totally excited about it. The electricity itself was understood to be a medical instrument. The building had been commissioned by this industrialist, Victor Zucklender, and was constructed as an addition to an earlier sanatorium that had been founded by the neuropsychiatrist Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who died before the Purkersdorf was completed, but was very influential by his theories. Very influenced by his theories. The Purkersdorf was influenced by the theories of this fellow Krafft-Ebing, who, by the way, had argued that the modern metropolis was damaging the nerves of its inhabitants, and that air, light, nature, and simplicity were the most effective therapies. He wrote these books on healthy and sick nerves and psychopathia sexualis. And he also coined the term masochismo, believe it or not, after the author Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, and also popularized the term sadism. So here, once again, health was understood in psychosexual and architectural terms. It's interesting to see that the Purkersdorf was frequented by a very notable group of patients, including Gustav Mahler on the top left, Arnold Schoenberg, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and Solomon Moser, who had designed the furniture that you saw, and who also used to check himself in and out of the sanatorium. Even the architect on the right, Joseph Hoffman, checked himself in and out of the sanatorium frequently. He had suffered and was treated for a nervous disorder prior to the commission of the Purkersdorf, and apparently it was this incident that inclined him to accept the commission. The Purkersdorf, believe it or not, affected patients with a wide variety of medical conditions, including nervous disorders, neurasthenia, eating disorders, substance abuse, and hysteria. They may also check themselves in with tuberculosis, and maybe some of those people that went in with some nervous disorder of some kind came out the other way with tuberculosis, but they didn't put two and two together. All these sanatoriums treated all these kinds of diseases. And what is interesting is that the sanatorium have become a new kind of social space for the Viennese upper class that felt that this was a really great place to be. This is Solomon Moser, the designer of the furniture. I don't know exactly what he was suffering from, but here you have a picture of him at the time of the commission of the Purkersdorf. And as I say, he kept checking himself in and out of the Purkersdorf. This is a very important person, who was a journalist and a critic of a newspaper, and he described the Purkersdorf as a cross between a modern hotel and a modern therapeutic center. And Karl Kraus, of course, much more caustic, described it as a healing swindle institution. They say they will heal you, but in fact, they don't have any idea of what you have. Right? So critics, as I say, hail the building as one of clarity and truth. The success of the institution owe enormously to the modernity of architecture. In fact, modern was becoming such a new and sophisticated test among the bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia who were supposed to dine around a single white table at the Purkersdorf in a kind of talking cure, or sleeping what they understood as completely Spartan white rooms, and subject themselves to these regimes that you saw before of electric treatments. But what's interesting here, the interesting thing here is the association of cubic architecture and cubic furniture with mental and physical health was so strong for architecture to act as a kind of effective placebo. So a lot of people will check themselves in and feel that they were actually much better after having spent some time there. It's also interesting that the idea also made its way into literature. If you think about Thomas Mann, his short novel Tristan, who he wrote in 1903, the same year precisely as the construction of the Purkersdorf, is set, this novel, in an imaginary sanatorium, the Einfried, which he describes as a long, wide, rectilinear building, warmly recommended, he says, for lung patients, but also for patients of all sorts, sufferers of gastric disorders, people with defective hearts, paralytics, rheumatics, nervous sufferers of all grumblings. When one of the patients, Hark Clotterhand's wife, asked another, "Why are you in the sanatorium? Really, what cure are you taking?" Mr. Espinel, he answers, "Cure? Oh, I'm having myself electrified a bit, nothing worth mentioning. But I will tell you the real reason why I'm here, madam. It is a feeling for style. Obviously, people feel one way among furniture that is soft and comfortable and voluptuous, and quite another among the straight lines of these tables, chairs, where are we? These tables, chairs and draperies. This brightness and hardness, this cold, austere simplicity and reserved strength, madam, it has upon me the ultimate effect of an inward purification and rebirth. It is morally elevating beyond a doubt. So you see here, clearly in this novel, that precisely style is the true cure of whatever ails this Mr. Espinel, who, by the way, wears a white jacket and a white hat in this all white building in a spotless white region, all covered in snow, and with white enamel armchairs and white folding doors and white painted gallery, inhabited, he says, by the white faces and white hands of the patients with their white veil, desire by passion driven. So if you read this novel, it's a very short novel, it's online, I recommend it. You will see that whiteness is the most insistent feature of the building, the landscape, and the patients in this infant sanatorium. Of course, this is not by chance. The architectural cure. Davos in Switzerland was famously the epicenter of this phenomenon of the modern cure. In 1910, there were already as many as 26 sanatoriums, including this one, a famous one, the Swanson, that was built between 1899 and 1900, and is the only sanatorium that is described by name in Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain. It was a collaboration between a doctor, Lucius Spengler, and two young architects from Zurich, and an engineer, Robert Maillard, who has been working for Hennebieke. So you have that this is the first building in entire Switzerland that was constructed in reinforced concrete and became the model for a modern sanatorium. Right? So the most advanced medical treatment, again, coincides with the most advanced technology in architecture. The architecture of the Schwabs, even if it doesn't look to you that way, is brutally modern in its horizontality and abstraction for the time, right? It has a 100-meter long facade, an endless corridor. The building is very much like an ocean liners with all parts subordinated to these terraces, where that are the therapeutic spaces and are dimensioned for these patients that are reclining in these long and chaise lounge, and in a cure that was to be undertaken, believe it or not, between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. in winter and in summer. So you have this period photograph of a group of patients lying in the chairs, and then you have this one with all of them packed together and in the terrace and completely covered in this thick blanket of snow, and yet apparently happy. Thomas Mann, always kind of sensitive to architectural detail, describes this therapeutic chaise lounge with care, evoking a philosophy of life on the edge and in the horizontal. This therapy of the horizontal was also central to the Balth Sanatorium, also in Davos, where Katia Mann, Thomas' wife, Mann stayed, and that inspired him to write The Magic Mountain. Thomas Mann's novel evokes the social life in this very modern building where everything was wrapped in white, even the patients here wrapped in white, about to receive hydrotherapy. Katia Mann was in fact one of the first patients in this brand new sanatorium. She fell ill in 1912 after the birth of her fourth child. Her mother was convinced that Katia was suffering not from tuberculosis, but from exhaustion, having had 4 children and 2 miscarriages in less than 5 years, managing a large household and even typing Thomas Mann's manuscript. The irony here is that Katia Mann had been studying mathematics and experimental physics with Wilhelm Röntgen, nonetheless, the discoverer of X-ray. But her mother had encouraged her to abandon her studies and to marry Thomas Mann at the age of 21. Whatever her ailment, she stayed in and out of sanatoriums up to 1914, when during the war she went back to home and have 2 more children, as you can see here. In any case, tuberculosis was often confounded with nervous disorders, and its inevitable melancholy meant that the standard cure was also a psychological one. Sanatoriums offer not just an escape from the city, but an escape from normal domestic life with the control of this regime and a steady but distracting daily rhythm in the company of new friends. This hyper-design space of the clinic even represents a new form of domestic elegance. Katia Mann said that the experience had strengthened her so that she could stand it all. And of course, there was a lot to stand. World War I, exile to the United States, then the suicide of her favorite song, Klaus.
and later the suicide of her second son, Michael. This modern ocean liner environment for the rich and fabulous, if you want, became kind of democratized with sanatoriums such as the Zonestral in Hilversum, outside 24 miles or so outside Amsterdam. Zonestral means sunbeam in Dutch, and it was designed by Duker and Visué as a sanatorium for a union, for the workers' unions of the General Diamond Association. So you have this reinforced concrete white building, where the medical properties of the architecture are taken to the stream in a kind of manifesto. Zonestral was kind of a health machine, a factory for the manufacturing of healthy bodies, with this slogan, allow light, air, and sun, very much like the slogan of modern architecture. You have the patients that are wheeled out from their independent rooms into the terrace, which was no longer a social space as in earlier sanatorium. There is less interaction, as you can see, between the patients, who seem to be, at least in period photographs, they seem to be kind of immersed in their books. So their real interaction seems to be with the sun and with the machines, these complex instruments such as the latest respiratory analysis devices. I thought the individual rooms was some kind of an advance in a working class sanatorium. But again, reading Thomas Bernhardt, who spent many years in and out of sanatorium as a tuberculosis patient, and which infiltrated all his writing, one becomes aware that the most terrifying thing in a sanatorium was precisely when you would move to an individual room. That could only mean one thing, beyond the real. Death itself was hidden in sanatorium in Davos, for example, and in other places did not accept very ill patients because a death was a spot in their reputation. They even exaggerated the rate of cure, and subterranean tunnels carry the dead away and out of view. And at the swamp, as you can see there, 300 meters above the city of Davos, the bodies of the dead were sent down the mountain on toboggan in winter, as Thomas Mann describes it in The Magic Mountain. Well, this is also an idea that you find in literature. So already in the same novel that I mentioned before, Tristan, you have this quote from Thomas Mann. Sometimes a death takes place among the most severe cases. When this happens, no one knows. It is not even the person sleeping next door. In the silence of the night, the waxen guest is put away, and life at the infinite goes tranquilly on with its massage, its electric treatments, its douches, baths, with its exercise, its steaming and inhaling in rooms especially equipped with all the triumphs of modern therapeutic, right? So again, Paimio, who did not accept very ill patients, confined the ones that were more serious, presumably because they got sicker while they were in the sanatorium, to the basement of the building. So much for sun and air therapy. The moment something goes wrong, hidden, right? But if you think about it, death in modernity is always hidden. And then I want to think about what is happening in our times too. And I want to perhaps finish with this very quickly. That visual hygiene means also designing what you don't want to see or don't. So Otto Wagner, for example, planned for the Großstadt of 1911, a plan that I'm sure you have seen many times, but nobody reflects on this, which is part of the project, and that Wagner explained very clearly when he says that high-speed trains, you may want to ask yourself, what is the rush? Were to remove the dead, transporting the corpses in their coffins from especially designed mortuary stations to the cemeteries in the outskirts of the city. And goes on to say, every large city soon will be in a position to limit the transportation of corpses to the railroads, and it seems therefore appropriate that each neighborhood will have a mortuary station for this purpose. So every every neighborhood here will have a mortuary stations, and the beds are worth taking out of the city at high speed, not the living. The dead are at high speed. But of course, more significant than the architecture of the sanatorium as medical instrument is the impact of medical thought on all of modern architecture, the constant preoccupation with ventilation, with sunlight, with hygiene, and with white walls that turn all buildings into medical equipment. As Ulrich, which is the main figure in Robert Musill's famous novel, The Man Without Qualities, he writes, modern man is born in a hospital and dies in a hospital. Hence, he should also live in a place like a hospital. And then you realize this, of course, this novel is written, is the first generation that will be born in a hospital and most likely also will die in a hospital. But of course, the most striking point is, therefore, he should also live in a place like a hospital. And of course, Musil was probably referring to Wagner, who had already formulated the idea that modern man should live in a place like a hospital. And when he claimed that, for example, a hotel room, he says, should not be very different than a hospital room. Clean, white surface should replace the upholstered interiors of the 19th century hotel, where dust accumulates and cleanliness is latent. So, okay, so in fact, in the end, every building becomes, and not just hotels, becomes a kind of sanatorium. Think, for example, about the open air school in Amsterdam, built a couple of years after the Tonnestraal Sanatorium and designed by the same architects, Duker and Vigier, and now applying the principles of light, air, and sun, not to sick people, but to healthy children that are placed inside this kind of glass machine, and even required to sit up on the roof with their heads against this parapet in the bright sun with their sunglasses, and perhaps supervised by the pigeon on the race. The building was conceived itself as a light device like those used at the same time in heliotherapy in the 30s. So these are school children that in places in the northern Europe where there was less sun, they were required to pass by these machines to prevent tuberculosis. In any case, modern architecture went from being a cure for tuberculosis in these designs of sanatoriums that were done by experimental architects, as I mentioned before, to being the cure, to being an apparatus for the prevention of tuberculosis. So all of modern architecture was in fact presented to us, despite the fact that we have tried very hard to ignore this fact as a mechanism to prevent tuberculosis. And now, since we are running out of time, I'm going to pass this part perhaps about the Tugendhat house, which is very, very interesting, because here you have the Tugendhat house, the canonic figure building of modern architecture that was abandoned during the occupation of Czechoslovakia, and when the communists takes hold of this house and they say, what do we do with this house? They immediately think, oh, well, perfect. We can turn it into a sanatorium for handicapped children. So the whole place becomes a rehabilitation. This is the living room of the Tugendhat house that became kind of a place for people with orthopedic, children with orthopedic problems. Before it had been turned into also kind of dance theater. You see these kids going down the staircase to the garden in the Tugendhat house in a kind of Busby Berkeley kind of image, and these kids exercising in the sign of the Tugendhat. And again, it's also so fascinating to see how these communist bureaucrats who have probably no idea that the house had been designed precisely in the same spirit. And you have here the early photographs of the Tugendhat with the children of the Tugendhat playing naked in the sun, and that are of course uncannily echo in the photographs of handicapped children playing, exercising in the living room of the house. And it's also interesting, and you see this 11th reform ideas with the kids playing in the garden and with the plants. But anyway, so it's very, very interesting episode, but I'm going to pass very quickly and go into something about today, because in the title I already promised that I will go a little bit into the bed in the age of COVID, and why the bed, because I think, and I want to make this point very quickly because we don't have much more time, that the bed is actually has been the face of this pandemic, of this catastrophe. Beds is of course this piece of equipment that is usually hidden from view, but suddenly had been everywhere, from the front pages of newspaper to Zoom meetings. You know? First, if you remember, when we didn't really see anything, it was unbelievable how this pandemic was. We couldn't see anything inside hospitals. Journalists, who are normally in the front lines of any catastrophe, were not allowed inside. But we read of the urgent call for more hospital beds in the early days, to then beds overflowing hospitals. Sometimes we start getting some pictures of beds filling corridors and former waiting rooms, because of course nobody could be waiting anymore. Nobody was allowed except the patients. So any room of any size in the hospital became a room for beds. The whole hospital was taken over by beds. But then the beds started to make new spaces. You have seen all these images in many parts of the world, in tents, in gymnasia, in parks, in ships, in convention centers, these haunting images of cavernous spaces with hundreds of empty beds in kind of a grid, like you can see here, each with or in a park, in Central Park here, when they put this hospital, or in the Javits Center in New York, right? So you have all this bed in a big, with an oxygen tank and a domestic lung, like waiting rooms. Very much like when I saw this image in the press, I was very much reminded of Jacques Tati playtime with these cubicles that are now also very much part of our life, also in terms of our working spaces. The question dominating the media again was how many beds, how many are occupied, how many people are surviving the bed. A bed with a ventilator became an ICU bed, as you know, so the bed itself became the room, became the architecture. Even perhaps you may have seen, I even saw it with my own eyes, this kind of horrifying image in the streets of New York in March, in the peak of the pandemic, transporting the sick in like portable rooms, like this one encased in plastic bubbles, very much reminiscent of the 1960s science fiction architecture. Beds on the move became common and frightening sight in the streets if you were living in places like me in New York, but definitely in the media, with medical professionals completely wrapped up in protective gear, like terrestrial astronauts, complete with oxygen tanks. These portable beds act as the link between the domestic bed, of course, and the hospital bed, a vast ecology of beds, then a whole landscape. These beds are actually not just in the media as the real facade of this new city, if you want, but they are also media platforms, Zooming, broadcasting, FaceTiming, bed-to-bed communication. Think of all those whose last contact was on a phone, held by, or an iPad, held by a nurse. Think of all of those connecting with friends and colleagues from bed. Think of all the beds you see today in the background of work meetings, socializing, comedy shows at home, music concerts, everywhere you see a bed. No bed is a secret anymore. This new architecture of the pervasive bed is not a side effect of the pandemic, by the way, but is exposed by it. And this always happens. Epidemics always expose what is already there historically. So, and of course, once exposed in my date again, but I leave it here because I promise I will not go further than this, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Beatriz. That was amazing. That was really interesting to go through that history and some of the thoughts about where we are today.
Thank you.
If there are questions, anyone that's attending at the moment, just hit the Q&A tab and you can type in your question and we'll try to get to those. I'll just ask while people are thinking about that. I was just struck with in the images that you showed in the historical sanatorium spaces, everyone was very close together. We're in such a this word bubble keeps coming up, right? Like, and you showed in the last images of even people being wheeled away in a kind of plastic container. There's such a emphasis now on being 6 feet away and being separate from each other. And in the historical examples you showed, everyone was actually like in the sanatorium, but very, very close together, and it's still a very contagious disease. So I don't know if you've thought about in our current world now, that difference, like how I'm wondering about how we can be in isolation collectively, especially in a place like New York where you are, how that's going to play itself out in a scale.
It's a very interesting question. Thank you so much. Of course, part of the problem is that they didn't really know. They didn't really. I mean, despite the fact that the tuberculosis bacillus was discovered, as I say, by Koch in 1888, because there was no way to find an antibiotic that was effective against the disease. The only cure turned out to be architecture. So that's why I think the great success of modern architecture may have to do with the difficulty of finding a medicine that will work, an antibiotic that was effective against it, until streptomycin was discovered in the middle of the war in 1943, and it still took a long time to make it available to people. The only cure was the sanatorium. But it was also fascinating to me to see that they will put together people with all kinds of different diseases, and that there was all this mysticism again about tuberculosis. So that you see, for example, when you read Thomas Mann, that the protagonist goes there to the sanatorium to accompany his cousin. The cousin is suffering from tuberculosis. He's not suffering from tuberculosis, but is staying in the sanatorium for a while, and he feels like a pariah. And finally, he gets tuberculosis, and now he is really accepted. And there was all these ideas that tuberculosis was a disease that affected people that were more creative or more this or more that, very, very different than other diseases. In terms of what is happening today, I think that one of the things that is most incredible is the reversal in a way. So tuberculosis was understood as a house problem. The house, all the doctors talk about the house being the center of infection, and you have to go out. And one way to go out is to go to a sanatorium. If you are rich and you have the means, you go there and you take the cure. You go to the mountains to take care. Another one is you open the windows. Or the invention in a way of the terrace in architecture is about bringing the outside in, to open the windows, to ventilate, all these ideas that are then in architecture. If you think about Richard Neutra, who in his house, the Lowell House in California, every room, and it's still in 1929, every room will be open to a terrace, and it was recommended that people will sleep outside in the open air, to prevent disease, to prevent tuberculosis. So these ideas were very dominant in architecture. But as I say, the problem was a house problem. Now, with COVID, the problem is a city problem. Is the virus is in public space, is in mass transit, is in inside restaurants, is in all this. So we are asked to stay at home. So the home becomes the safest space. So that's a very, very radical transformation of the tuberculosis. It's true too that we are also recommended that if we have to meet outside, because outside is definitely better, right, in terms of transmission of the virus. The same thing with tuberculosis. Somehow they felt that staying outside in the terraces in Davos or in Paimio, they were not communicating the disease. And besides, everybody there was supposed to be already with with tuberculosis in these later sanatoriums.
There's a question about that from Nick Fix. Says, Beatrice, fantastic lecture, thank you. Given the repetitive nature of the aggregation of the beds in the sanatoriums being revisited in the approach to COVID, do you think the scale of the bed and this notion of 6-foot distancing will inform interiors moving forward?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you very much, Nick, for your questions. Yes, the bed becomes the unit definitely in these sanatoriums, right? And the idea of the bed as defining the space is very, very important. And I think, well, it's a very important question. I haven't thought about it, but you know, when you look at all these spaces with the bed placed at a particular distance, and when you look at the pictures of the Javits Center with these cubicles, each one with a bed, etc., the bed becomes the unit, and the bed is kind of 6 feet, isn't it?
Yeah, so, there's a couple questions asked about that just from Gabrielle. The bed as a media platform and the pervasive bed, how will that impact domestic architecture? And similarly, the argument that the bed is the new room, what happens now? Is the mattress the new floor, meaning there's no place to stand, just lie and sit? Are rooms now less essential than internet connection? And how do real estate prices adjust accordingly? There's several questions around this idea of the bed as like almost the DNA now for how we think about cities.
Yes, and as I say, they pass very quickly, but I think the bed exposed something that was already there. And this is something that I was working way before the pandemic. It came to me completely by accident when in 2012 I read by chance, I must have been giving a lecture somewhere, and they always put in the hotels, they always give you the Wall Street Journal. And you are in that kind of funny moment in an airport, in a plane, where you cannot use the phone, and you are not leaving, but you cannot use the phone, and what do you do? And I read the Wall Street Journal from cover to cover. And the business section of all places, I read this story that 80%, imagine this, of young professionals in New York were working from bed. And I say, what's happening here, right? Well, because that is a major transformation in our lives. If 80% of young people, and this of course is still in 2012, still feeling very much the effects of the 2008 recession, with millions of people out of the traditional 9-to-5 work, and with office spaces in Manhattan practically empty or half empty, and an army of young people working with their laptops or with their telephones or wherever. In many times, the only private space they have is their bed, whether you are sharing the apartment in New York, imagine, with a group of people, and the only place you have is your bedroom, and the only place you have in fact is the bed. The bed, everybody has a bed. Well, everybody knows, but those of us privileged have a bed at least, right? Mm. And the bed becomes the unit in that sense. So I found it fascinating that this reality that I was already studying, and of course it has to do with the digital technologies, with the fact that we can work day and night, that work continuously, that some people are working in different time zones, that you may be waking up in the middle of the night to speak with Australia or with Japan or with China or wherever, right? And many people in this new gig economy, even if you think about the digital nomads, because I also looked into that way before the COVID. There was these articles in many newspapers and magazines about the new digital nomads that live, I don't know, in Florida or in Thailand, and they move to different places and they live in these new kinds of hotels, that actually the common spaces for socializing are the big deal, and you have a small room. And I realized, and they pointed out that they don't have a desk. And I say, why? Because nobody wants to work in a desk. Can you ask a young person? They all work in bed, right? Do you work in bed? I'm sorry, I cannot see your faces, and I don't know whether you work in bed. But if I ask any kid, if I ask my daughter, if I ask her friend, they all work in bed. I see them working in bed. So this is interesting, because if you look at it historically,
from the beginning of the 20th century, there were already a lot of artists and creative people like Proust or Matisse or whatever, that or Truman Capote, that he said he was a completely horizontal author. He could only work if he was on the horizontal, right? So all these creative people that articulated the idea that they have the best moments of creativity lying horizontally, right? And if you put that together with the horizontality of the 20th century tuberculosis patient lying on the chest, and with the horizontality of the divan of Freud and the horizontality of architecture, there could be a point to be made that the whole of the 20th century is on the horizontal, right? Now we are in a different situation now in which everybody is kind of an artist. In, you know, I mean, I know, and I am very concerned about that. That this is not so good as people make it believe. That the gig economy has a lot of problems with people very disenfranchised and with very little security, right? But sometimes people, and I make my business to talk to people, even when I'm in a taxi or whatever, I talk to people about. I remember when Uber started, right? And I was, for some reason, in Los Angeles, and I didn't have a car, and I would take Ubers, and I asked the taxi driver, how did he like it? And they, how did she like it? And they would say, you know, I used to work in McDonald's and I had to be there, and then they, from this hour to this hour, and then they kept changing the schedule and you didn't know which way it was. And now, you know, this is the car of my mother and she doesn't use it that much. And I go when I want, and when I see the price is high, I go out, and, you know, and I said, well, okay. So likewise, you hear from a lot of young people that they don't desire, they don't want what we had for a long time, which is this 9 to 5 kind of schedules and this kind of work. They prefer more this liberation. Well, to make the story short, I mean, I think this represents a new kind of city, and we as architects have to put ourselves, you know, as they say in Spain, the battery is on. You have to put your batteries. Like if the office buildings are half empty, and now with coronavirus even more half empty, when we have to think about what kind of city this means. If we are working more from home and working more from the bed, well, we are returning them to a more, if you want, pre-industrial way of life. Because of course this idea of the separation between the place of living and the place of work is completely new. It's very recent. It comes from the Industrial Revolution, and I'm sure it was very traumatic for that whole generation that all of a sudden had to go and commute to work, whether it's the factory or the office, and all this stress from this new reality. Well, we are now in a situation in which we are bringing the work is going back into the home, and further, I will say, into the bed, and that means a different kind of city and a different kind of bed.
Right. There was a comment that said capsule hotels come to mind, right? Like that in terms of how you're thinking about the bed and just that isolated space. But there's an interesting question.
The capsule hotels come to mind. It also comes to mind all these micro apartments in New York, for example. They have to change the regulations, you know, because people desire more and more. This is before COVID, of course, but even now more. A smaller and smaller apartment, and the regulation apparently didn't allow for this, so they have to change the regulation to make these micro apartments, which basically you open the door and there is a bed, because that's the priority of the space. And as happened to all of us when you are traveling, hey, you know, when I'm traveling, I don't have any I don't work in bed, but if I see a lot of people around here working in bed. But if I am myself traveling, I have no problem working in the bed of the hotel. I actually like it.
Right? Yeah. There's an interesting question from Karen Swanson. Thank you. Now, in the interest of energy efficiency, we design buildings that are so tight. How do we balance the need for this and the need for fresh air without creating, you know, sick buildings?
Yeah. That's so interesting. In the interest of you say that in the interest of energy efficiency, we design buildings that are so tight. How tight? Well, it's difficult because you cannot answer. But,
well, I think energy, like that window, even buildings that without operable windows, for example, so that you can't let cold air out and things like that. Energy efficiency meaning that they get so tightly closed and sealed without the
Okay. I didn't realize that. I think that's crazy. That's exactly the problem of modern architecture. Modern architecture actually was what brought us the sick syndrome building. Precisely, all these buildings that you cannot open gave all these new diseases. So what was supposed to be healthy for us turned out to be into our enemy. So I didn't realize that the interest of energy, because I have here actually almost the opposite. If you follow people like Forrest Makers, who teaches at Princeton, he has all kinds of very interesting ideas about energy efficiency without air condition, precisely, and with air circulation. So there are different forms of, I suppose, of thinking about energy efficiency.
There's another question about, from Daniel, the point that the pandemic allows us to work from home or to work in bed, brings up other health issues. For example, the strain that your body goes through when working on a surface that is meant to be occupied horizontally is tremendous. It's interesting that the avoidance of the pandemic would bring about other physical health issues. So is it healthy to work in bed? You know, all the kind of that we have.
It is absolutely not healthy, and we have to think about it. That's also what I'm saying. It's probably better than sitting the whole day, because I mean, what we forget here is that for a long time we've been talking and there's been a lot of discussion about how sitting was the new smoking, because all these people like me that spend a lot of time sitting down, writing, whatever, or not to mention in offices, etc., has huge problems from sitting down. We are not supposed to, probably it's better to be lying down, but it has its own problems. And besides, the beds are not designed for work, so there's a whole kind of industry of contraptions to work in bed, because of course it's completely uncomfortable. So that's a design issue. How do you design a bed in which you can work, in which you can do all kinds of things, which is what is happening now. But I'm fascinated by the question that the avoidance of the pandemic will bring another physical health issue, because you can argue that this is always the case, that cities are basically layers upon layers of mechanisms that were put in place to avoid particular disease, and with each one of them you create another problem. So every time we are, and we forget very quickly, every time a pandemic passes, then we think we are acting towards coronavirus as this was the first thing that this has happened. But if you go back to the history of pandemics, you know that the quarantine actually comes from quarenta, from the Italian, which is 40 days of quarantine, that people were supposed to observe when there was a plague in the city. So, and these ideas of spaces of quarantine go back centuries, right? So, and every time things are put in place to counter or to avoid particular diseases. And if you could write a history of the city from the point of view only of disease, and it would be fascinating, I think, to look at all these layers upon layers from all the infrastructure, for example, in the 19th century that was put in place to avoid, 18th and 19th century to avoid cholera, for example. The sewage, the clean water, for a long time, they thought that cholera was transmitted by the air, the miasma theory of the disease, until they discovered that it was actually a contaminated well in the center of London, what had created that huge epidemic. You know, there was no care of with such things as the water system and the sewage system.
Yeah, I mean, the question for cities is going to be huge and interestingly already being debated, right, about density and how is it a question of closeness and proximity and density of people, or is it actually just moving around between places, and that maybe cities just have to be more like little villages where they're tightly, you know, there's lots of people, but you don't have to cross a lot of boundaries to get places. So I think, yeah, from the scale of the bed to the room to the city, yes, this research of yours is really going to be fascinating to see how that plays out in a place like New York.
Right, in a place like New York, yeah, and you know, it's kind of interesting because a lot of the discussion, I think, has been very anti-urban, and I am completely
against that, maybe because I'm a city person from birth, basically. So, cities, of course, accelerate contagion because of the density, but are also great incubators of ideas, and that's why we are so fascinated with them. And it's also interesting to see what is happening, where right now, if you look at what COVID is doing, New York is actually doing pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Very well, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Not just the state, but the city even better than the state. So for at the beginning, it was it's all about the cities, and I think a lot of people lower the guard for that reason. Let the people from New York die, because there's such an anti-New York sentiment in this country, and that I don't think they gave a damn whether we die or live, right? But now it's actually more prevalent in rural areas, so go figure. Exactly. I mean, I think what you have to do is to follow the medical advice and use your mask and be careful about what you're doing. It's not so much a question of the city, but about also taking care, right?
Right. I think maybe just one more question we have time for from Zosha. How do we determine the line between what is good or healthy for humans versus what is good for efficiency, say for economics or environments? I mean, this is a common question, right? Like who or what should we determine what the priorities are? Is the CDC now making architectural regulations, right? Is that who makes, or is it government policy? It's going to be interesting to see where these influences come from.
Right. No, thank you, Sophia. It's a very, very important question that is all the time in the front lines. In many ways, this idea that we couldn't let the economy die is what has brought us to this problem. So I suppose that I will say that we have to do what is good for and healthy for humans. We have to take care of ourselves. One of the things that strike me about this pandemic, and particularly to the discourse from architects that you probably have heard constantly, is that they are all focusing on the physical city. We can make these partitions, or we can make this, or we can make that. Okay, sure, we are architects. We can try to help. But the most striking thing about this pandemic is the way in which has made visible the so-called invisible city of hidden workers, of people without homes, of people without health insurance. All of this has become absolutely visible to all of us, all these workers in the medical workers in the front lines, which have no choice, but to go to work. So I think my hope will be that the city of the future, more than how it looks, it will be a more equitable city. So the first thing will be to think about, and this is a very good occasion, every pandemic in history has made people rethink entirely their situation, right? Because it exposes exactly what is wrong with that system. And
exactly.
Has exposed so much pain that was already there, and that we're totally ignoring it. So, we can talk about the bed, but how many people don't have even beds? I mean, that's a much more important question. The question of housing as a human right, of health insurance as a human right, all these enormous inequities is just staggering.
Yeah, and I think, you really hit on the other question that was there about beds for the disenfranchised. How do we occupy? Can we start to occupy these empty spaces? And in turn, the meetings.
How about all these office buildings that are empty? How about
exactly,
that?
Right.
Or all these people that have
inequality. Yeah.
Yes. And all these people that have abandoned their house to go to their second house or their third house or whatever. I mean, this is crazy. 1 million people have left New York. All the office buildings are half empty, and in the meantime, you go down the street and there are so many people sleeping in the sidewalk and you go like, this is not possible, right?
Yeah.
So totally, this I think is the most important thing. Then we can think about other things.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you so much, Beatriz, for being with us and for this topic. It's just so timely and interesting, but something obviously you've been thinking about for so many years. So it's just fascinating to have that connection now in a new way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been very, very important for me to be with you and to have the opportunity to discuss these questions. And thank you very much for all of you with your wonderful questions and engagement. I really enjoy each one of them.
Great. Thanks so much.
Bye.